Welcome everyone to this seminar today, which we have in honor of 2023 year's laureate for the Global Environmental Prize, Professor Eduardo Brundisio, and we're very proud to have you here, and looking forward to a fantastic afternoon to discuss from the depth of your research, and you will understand why everyone thought that Eduardo was very well deserved laureate this year. Fantastic achievements. So this seminar is organized by the Bayer and the Stockholm Resilience Center and the Volvo Environment Prize together. So we all greet you very, very welcome. And Eduardo Brundisio is an anthropologist and has worked for a very, very long time studying the complex social ecological system of the Amazon and from the ground. So he has really contributed to a very good understanding of the conditions people are facing in this region, and also how transformation to sustainability could be in a much more fair, equitable, and just way, and we will hear more about that. So this afternoon, Eduardo will give a presentation on his research. This will be followed by another presentation from Jamila Haider on some similar experiences, but more from the global north. And we will have a coffee break, and after that, a panel discussion, and the audience will be invited to participate. So with that, I will greet Eduardo, very, very welcome to this, and talk about smallholder food producers and their role in the global food system. So please.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the supporting crew and Marie and everyone who helped to organize this. I'm also very pleased, I have to say, that I have one of my students from IU, Zakawani, here. It made me really happy to know that we're overlapping here, right? And next week we're back to, environmental anthropology at the Indiana University. This has been a fantastic week. Sharing and meeting with the Volvo Prize Committee, with people at the Volvo Foundation, and many colleagues to reflect on this long-term research that we have in the Amazon, right? And try to bring some attention, I guess, and some light to some of the most daunting, I guess, challenges of the region. That tend to be, as I would say, at the shadows of other issues that tend to be associated with the Amazon. So I really appreciate the opportunity that the Volvo Foundation and the prize gave me to really highlight those issues at this particular time. Today, and I'm also very thankful, for the Baker Institute and for the Academy for helping us to bring this particular topic to attention. So I really appreciate the opportunity that we can center attention in another topic that tends to be just like some of the issues that we've been discussing in the Amazon this week, like the urbanization problems, the governance problems, the rural poverty of the region. Attention to an issue that I consider to be one of the most invisible crises that we have today. The basis, this is not a typical research presentation in the sense that I'm combining different pieces of work, this sort of global analysis of employment in food production system with some examples from the Amazon. So what I'm going to do is sort of share some reflection points on the topic, from a global perspective, all the way to some examples in the region that I won't be able to develop in detail, right? So I hope that we'll get the general message and narrative so we can have an interesting conversation today. So again, thank you for being here. Thank you for the opportunity to bring these issues, to a conversation with you. So this article came up just a few months ago at the very beginning of August, I believe, and was part of a long process of conversations with editors and reviewers. And I'll share some of that conversation with you a little bit to show some of the underlying issues that are behind, the topic of smallholder food production in contemporary contexts. For that article, and one of the things that was we didn't expect that in that way. We're analyzing trends in global food systems, particularly from the perspective of employment, across 180 countries. So we put together a data set from the International Labor Organization, the World Bank, FAO, and a number of other sources, and start both analyzing and project trends that we have seen in employment as defined by the ILO in food production since 1990. So the data for me and the findings that we had were, to be honest, very striking. When we started this project, it was a project about aging in rural areas. That was the topic that we're looking at, the aging of rural areas and the implications for the vitality of rural economies. As we processed the data, it became very clear that some of the real question relates to opportunities and employment in rural areas. So what the data showed, and actually the analysis itself is much more detailed than that. We have clustered different groups of countries according to different trends in each of the development categories that are based on UN development categories. This is a sort of an average and the shadows variations across countries in each development group. But to me at least, finding that since 1990, we have lost 200 million jobs in the food production sector, right? Was a stunning finding. I didn't imagine the scale of unemployment that has been taking place during the past 30 years. When we talk about food production, and when we talk about employment in food production, we're talking about agriculture, fisheries, pastoralism, forest management, wild species management, and harvesting. And I'll give some numbers to that in a second. More interesting and more concerning than that was when we modeled the projection of potential unemployment following a similar trajectory to 2030, right? And for that, we put data on population trends and the number of people coming into the job market, right? That enter the job market during this decade. What is projected following this particular trend is actually an acceleration of the trends that we have seen so far. To a projected 120 million jobs that will be lost, maybe or not, in these various food production sectors. It's probably, of course, you won't be surprised that the biggest share of that loss will happen, as broadly speaking, the Global South, but particular regions of the Global South, Africa countries in particular, some Latin American countries, and some Asian countries that are also under very fast decline. So that's the scenario, that's the message that we try to come across in the article. And that started a really interesting conversation that I think got me to think, even deeper in terms of the root causes of these problems, right, compared to the other structural forces that are driving that. I'm sharing one anonymous reviewer of this conversation that really interestingly basically reflect the other three reviewers that we got. It was very surprising to us how consistent, how similar, sometimes using the same phrasing and the same explanation, for the causes of the problem. But what really caught my attention was how acceptable this situation is. How normalized that this situation is in our minds to consider that a process of losing employment in food production is inevitable, right? And in many cases, some of the comments that I got, desirable, right? As a natural progress of society, right? And a natural expectations that we have for people seeking a better life or a more modern life or, other perspectives. So that was really what got me, I think, really thinking about the larger cause of that is how natural has become for us as a whole, as society, to talk about it as, part of where we are going, right? And the way we think and the way we talk about rural areas and indigenous areas in general, right? As sort of a relic, if not, some thing like that. Now, the question here is, what does it actually mean? If we really take seriously, right, that we believe in this trajectory of society and this process of inevitable consolidation of the food system, is squeezing smaller scale production or indigenous-based production, and the eventual incorporation of them into urban systems or into consolidated system, agricultural system, or as a labor force, elsewhere, what does actually mean for society as a whole? Are we accepting, even without acknowledging it or thinking about it, that yes, we're going to become very homogenized. There won't be place for indigenous groups. There won't be place for small scale and very diverse food production. Is that the message that we sort of inherently accept, right? Even though, we don't think about it when we talk about this process of transformation. So, that's the question that I want to pose to you, right, as a reflection point, and how embedded this is in our way of thinking about society. I'll just briefly mention, because I can get into a rant here to talk about the history of this, but I think it, at least in part, at least in my arguments, the root of the way we think about societal transformations, of course, it goes very deep. You can go back to Aristotle, to think about the place of food producers in society. But in the contemporary sense, it is, I think, a relic of models of social evolution that became very popular in the 19th century, right, as an explanation of the eventual sort of incorporation of all the diverse societies that, the colonial period brought to face into the idea of civilization, right? The barbarism, the savagery, the barbarism to civilized systems. That model of unilinear development, or eventually conversion of all sorts of societies, right, into a civilized, modern, urbanized society, sort of, is a very lasting model. That's part of my argument here. You see variations of that model developing through the 20th century in many different formats. You can look at economic structural theories, which has many important findings. I'm not trying to compare anything, but it sort of also repeats that eventually, like the reviewer said, those structural adjustments will consolidate sectors, will converge to equilibrium around efficient economic systems. You see that in modernization theory on the stages of transformation and modernization that says exactly what the reviewer said. It's inevitable, and we're going to be incorporating those systems, as part of a kind of more urbanized, homogeneous, consolidated food production systems. And you see other sorts of, different attempts to explain that have developed in different languages during the 20th century. You also see a lot of reactions. My own field in environmental anthropology, and when I look at the roots of cultural ecology, a field in which I was sort of brought up with, the very rise of cultural ecology was a discussion about unilinear versus multilinear evolution. right? And the argument at that time was exactly that. It was dialoguing with social evolutionary models of the 19th century that posed this conversion of society, and talking about, the actual, possibilities of multilinear ways of change in which people adapting to different environments and different conditions find different pathways to meet their needs and their aspirations. So it's a discussion that goes back a long time. More recently, you see many versions of this, including from here, right, that talks about alternative development pathways in many formats. So retaking that discussion about multilinear change, into the contemporary conversation about sustainable development. So I just want to touch on that, to sort of set that underlying conversation that is very old, right? But that resurfaces in many different ways. What is the actual reality of small-scale food production globally? It's very different than we see, than these pictures, point to. You think about, small-scale fisheries, for instance, disregarded in many regions, like even for Brazil, for the Amazon. I cannot find statistics about small-scale fisheries. I can't find. That is an indication of how it is. It is employ 110 million people, more than the combined total of industrial fisheries, oil, gas production, shipping, and tourism. It's not a minor global industry in social and economic importance. Pastoralists, significant share of many regions. Smallholder farmers that are smaller than 2 hectares account for 85% of the farm units, but 35% of the food production globally. If we take farming, family farms, it's a very broad category because it includes very large farms and very small farms, but if you count that category, it's up to 70% of global food production. Okay, and widespread harvesting from recent IPBES assessment also sustain, a significant part of the world. It's not a matter of scale, as Maria said. The scale is there. It's a matter of how we see that and how we consider that in terms of importance, and therefore we turn it around in recognizing with support, right? And so the scale is there, and the relevance is there. This is the official total agriculture employment data, whether it's underestimated or not, but it's 25% of the global workforce, 98.9% in rural areas, and I didn't put the stats there, but the majority of this population are within the larger categories of the global poor or the extreme poor. So they have a very important role, not only social and in what they produce, right, but in terms of the economic foundations that they serve for a large population, and 55% of indigenous people. What are the consequences of that? And that's one of the things that we need to, sort of connect the dots, that we tend to think about this as isolated or small scale or as a necessary pathway of development. But it has, of course, direct consequence at the level of individuals and families in local communities, right? When you change, and if someone loses employment or stop working in agriculture, that affects other 4, 5, or 6 people, right? It affects community infrastructure, it affects community service, it affects, community, sort of cohesion, and a number of other issues that are affected by the process of, particularly when it involves migration. It affects landscape and the food system itself, whether you look at it at landscape management, or whether you look at it from the point of view of agrobiodiversity and the memory and the knowledge that goes with agrobiodiversity. And eventually it's transforming larger landscapes, whether left to abandonment or converted, in most cases, to consolidated large-scale agriculture operations and other operations. And it impacts migration directly. And I think we don't talk sufficiently about this consequence that have this multiplying effect, right? And recognizing that that has a starting point where and how we consider the role, the importance of these areas, for the regions themselves and internationally. I want to sort of shift to the last part to talk a little bit about some of the research that we do, looking at small-scale production systems in the region where we work, in the Amazon, and sort of very briefly, just some examples, right? That behind this image and behind this sort of global trend of the eventual disappearance, you find very different perspectives on the ground. I mean, and that's what we want to show here. This is a project that Maria Tango, I, and several other colleagues have developed for several years called the Agents Project that ended last year, which documented place-based initiatives around the Amazon, mostly the Brazilian Amazon. And what was interesting about this is that what we found when we start to do through a number of participatory work is how active, how many responses, how many actions is on the ground to try to revert the conditions that are pushing people out of rural areas or making those systems less viable. So we documented in our database over 200 plus types of initiatives in over 900 locations. And these are production systems, a governance system, and market initiatives, all in one way or another connected to food production. And what we want to show here, is that behind that, it's particularly the image that we have about the Amazon, there's a lot of actions, there's a lot of efforts, right, to try to revert that equation. And here are examples of non-timber forest activities, timber activities, agriculture and agroforestry activities. Some of these dots have many dots around them. We have to think about that too. Because these are points in a database, right? So, fisheries and community-based management of fisheries. So it paints a very different landscape than the one that we expect to see in terms of this disappearing of the rural economy, the conversions of rural economies, to consolidated large-scale system. As I said, I'm passing fast today's slide. It's just sort of to set a general message. One example that I've been studying for since the late 80s is acai agroforestry. It's one example where from the basis of smallholding production, knowledge, agroforest techniques in response to market has transformed landscapes around the Amazon, right, into a system of food production, right, that is highly efficient and has revitalized really the economy of large sections in many municipalities of the Amazon. These are, and you see why I put this here, these are works that we've been doing as well. So we start with the Agents Project on mapping agroforestry systems using deep learning and satellite data to show the scale of the systems in the region. Why is this important? And you'll see in a second. So acai has expanded since the late 80s to become one of the most inclusive crops in the region. It has started and it has become a global crop through the hands of smallholder producers and through the knowledge of smallholder producers. It has gained, of course, scale, right? And now it has been expanding just like many other monocultural systems in the region, although the strongest base is still in agroforestry systems. Now, when you look, these are rural areas that I got around Abaetetuba. If you look at the data in terms of rural population decline for the past 20 years, the areas where you have strong acai production have reverted that. You have very high density rural populations. And I was just in this region like a month ago, meeting, talking to someone at the city. The city was very active, has the sort of the business very active because there's a lot of money circulating. And one of the persons said, yeah, but the wealth is out there, right? It's in the forest back there. But acai, it's a really interesting case. I've been working on this for many years to show that what we conceptualize as productive land changed the way we see who are the producers, right? And the importance of different production. So I usually do, for many years, I've been doing this thing that I put here on the one side of the image. If you consider acai as just an extractive forest management system, And you basically see a forest landscape with no actors, or not a productive land if you don't consider forest that much of a productive land from the point of view. If you map and show the distribution of actual acai agroforestry, it suddenly becomes the most important production system in the regions, and the producers, who are often not classified as even producers, become the most important economic actor in the region. So the way we think and the way we conceptualize the systems really shape what we end up valuing or we end up disregarding. And so I find this example very useful. It's also useful to understand what are some of the structural conditions that allow or not some of these very successful production systems to generate income and to be converted to development. So this is a value chain, and the basic message here is that value is aggregated proportional to the distance that it takes from the region of production. And therefore, while it has created an incredible economy in the region, the largest share of that economy still happens away from the region. So the precarity, the municipality and rural problems persist. Producers are reacting. These are some of the cooperatives that we show in that map, or some of the dots, where you have many organizations and sort of grassroots-based cooperatives that are shifting that equation to do value aggregation right where the fruit is produced. Lots more to talk about here, but I have a very short time, and I just want to give a flavor of that. This is a very busy slide because I try to just put everything there, but the important point is that you see some of the headings there. Right? And these are some of the points that we discuss in that article, on reverting the situation and reverting the image that we have about small-scale food production through different kind of entry points. And the first one, I would say, it's a cultural mindset. It's a mindset change. It's how we recognize and value the values and the contributions of smallholder food production. Just that shift, turn around what we prioritize in supporting, in providing infrastructure, in providing development, assistance to make it happen, and providing support for rural areas. In the case of the Amazon, one of the most precarious and poor in Latin America. A second point, and that's a key point, at this particular stage, where investments in climate for mitigation and adaptation, the new biodiversity agreement that is pumping up significant, funds into biodiversity conservation. These are powerful leverage tools, right, that can be oriented, besides, of course, the incredible amount of perverse subsidies that sustain agriculture and other sectors, sort of reverted and have a social goal and a social purpose. And I think there's a great opportunity there to turn some of these funds in sort of that productive, in supporting systems that are meeting economic goals, social goals, and environmental and climate goals. So I'm just being very quickly here, and the third one is what the cooperatives showed. Reverting the model of value chains that we have, that in the case of the Amazon, as I illustrated here, is structured on the base of extracting commodities and raw materials for value aggregation elsewhere. So it doesn't matter how well the producers are doing many times, how well they reach the goals, or they can, reconcile production and conservation, but the value does not sort of return in the same proportion of the contribution. Part of that equation has to do with verticalizing those value chains and providing support so that producers groups can have the opportunity to generate the values themselves. That has one important point that we actually discussed during the Volvo visit, which is logistics. And logistics, and here logistics, broadly speaking, on the infrastructure that connects farmers, producers, fishers to consumers and markets, are some of the more unequal sectors that we have, in many regions. And as we see improvement in logistics, for instance, in parts of the Amazon, you see large ports, you see, railways, you see other kinds of logistics, they're highly exclusionary. And I think we need to shift the mindset in terms of logistics and think about under what conditions can we create inclusive logistics, that allow the smallholder producers of all kinds also to benefit from that, right? So this is the very sort of brief message that I want to give. So we start a conversation, and I'm looking forward to hear from my colleagues, and thank you again for your attention.
Thank you very much. I will ask Jamila Haider to come up here and to give perspectives also from smallholders, but in a different part of the world. And Jamila is a researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Center and a team leader, and has been doing research on smallholder farmers, both in Central Asia and now recently more in Austria. And Jamila is also world famous. She has written the world's best cookbook.
Yeah.
In case you didn't know.
And is also planning a new book, so watch out. So, what's enough? Please, Jamila.
Yes. Thank you, Thomas, and thank you everyone watching today, and thank you, Eduardo, for inspiring so many of us over the years, both in the research and science that you do, and also in how you do it.
Thank you.
So yes, as Thomas has just introduced, I'm Jamila Haider, and I'm presenting today also a collaborative work with alpine dairy farmer Preya Sepp. And Eduardo's just given us this brilliant overview and insight into the importance of small-scale producers globally, and also particularly then in Brazil and in the global south. So now we'll shift our focus briefly to Europe, where trends of homogenization of crops and agriculture, and also the amalgamization of power in agriculture, has, over the past 50 years in particular, also really raised the question of the role of small-scale producers, as the reviewer did on your paper, Eduardo. So I'd like to invite you to dive deep into a particular place with me. This is Gastein Valley in Salzburg province of Austria. And we see here some dairy cows grazing in a very biodiverse meadow. This is at about 1,800 meters. And in the distance also some mowed meadows. This is really hard work to maintain these landscapes. In European policy language, these are also called high nature value landscapes. But these aren't just high nature value landscapes. These are also highly valued cultural landscapes, and as I just showed, require a lot of work to maintain by small-scale and family farmers. And nature and culture have co-evolved here over millennia, creating so-called biocultural landscapes. As we saw, there's domesticated animals grazing the mountains, maintaining these flowering meadows and pastures in a system of alpine transhumance, where people have moved from permanent valley dwellings to mid and high altitude pastures. This has been happening since the Bronze Ages, 3,000 years ago. Most remaining farmers in the valley have recorded family histories of almost 1,000 years. And this mountain hut, this is Preya Hochheim, was built in the 1850s after a really landmark change in the Habsburg Empire, where peasant farmers actually got land rights for the first time. And this is Sepp and Monica, and it was the 5 generations past where someone said, or his great-great-great-grandfather said, I'm going to use this landmark change and build a hut here. So this is also an area of natural constraints, and they're eligible for specific EU CAP funding. And according to a recent European Commission report, these so-called areas of natural constraints farms are less intensive, have lower workforce intensity with less inputs, lower stocking intensity, and include more environmentally beneficial practices. So these are really valued, iconic landscapes, but they're also changing. The farmers are the stewards of these practices, and their practices matter. This is a recent projection of land abandonment, and the shaded areas are mountain areas, and in red we can just, I guess, focus here on, pointer, tricky there, the Alps here. Yeah. I can just point there, even harder, there we go. In the Alpine region, it's orange and deep red, so there's a high risk of land abandonment. And what I've tried to just show in the previous slides is when farmers leave these areas, those landscapes are going to change drastically, compounded with climate change, which in the 6th assessment report by the IPCC has also highlighted mountain areas as particularly vulnerable to drastic climate variability. Actually, I did want to say one more thing here, which was also, so Eduardo presented already some of the challenges to small-scale farming. So in mountain areas in Europe specifically, there will be particular climate challenges. And these are also, farmers depend on subsidies because of these difficult areas. And so while subsidies are absolutely necessary to all the farmers I have met in these areas to continue alpine farming, the way that these are implemented is actually also a barrier to change, which I'm going to present briefly. So it's in this context in 2022 that I set out to study the resilience of small-scale alpine dairy producers, because I also really wanted to know, within the context of Austria, which for Central and Northern Europe has a relatively high proportion of small-scale producers, what's enabling them to actually stay as farmers? That was the basic question. I build off of the definition of resilience as a process of ever-changing capacity to deal with change through interacting dynamics of persisting, adapting, and transforming. So I focused on farmers who were still producing cheese at these high alpine summer pastures as an example of a practice that maintains these biocultural landscapes. And it was this way that I met Prea Sepp and Monica. And I think they show this, it's not inevitable, but it's also not ideological. Yeah. Sepp always says, don't put me in a box or category or try to theorize me. I just do what makes sense for me, on my land, and for my family. And that's it. And Sepp kept returning to one thing again and again. He kept saying, I do it because I do everything in a way that is because it's enough. It's an explanation as his way of life. And this notion of sufficiency struck for both of us as something core to sustainability. So I became really fascinated, actually, with how he decides this boundary of what is enough on technology, on production, for example. So how he chooses what to hold on to and what he chooses to let go of. And we want to tell you a short story of what that means. So it's a very stretched screen here. I'm going to read something that Sepp told me. A few years ago, we suddenly had a lot of snow here on the Alm in August. The dairy cows hadn't finished their 60 days at the summer pasture necessary for subsidies. So I had to bring them down to pastures around the hunter's hut to graze, about 2 kilometers down the mountain, and back up to the Alm, 2 times a day to be milked, 4 times up and down. This didn't make sense. I recalled a conversation with a guest from New Zealand a few years ago. He asked me how often we milk the cows, and I replied, twice a day, obviously. And he said, what do you mean, obviously? We milk our cows once a day. And Sepp said, this is crazy. Everyone's always milked the cows twice a day. Sepp continues, I filed this idea away in the drawer of ideas I have in my mind. When I hear something interesting, and if it makes sense, I put it in that drawer until it might be useful. I have a lot of time to think in my work. It's a lot of physical work. I ran through different scenarios and carefully considered all the risks. Then that day, in August 2018, with a snowstorm on the Alm, I decided to try it out. I simply didn't bring the cows up in the evening. Our cows produce less milk, but it's enough. It's enough to have a good life. And the cows are not disadvantaged. They also have a bit more time for themselves. More time to graze, more time on the pastures. And now I have more time for other on-farm activities, which easily makes up for the slightly lower milk quantity. And we still produce a high-quality food product. So, routine and rhythm characterize farming, but every day is also different. A bit like a drop of water, because food producers are entangled with the living world. And the only constant thing here is change. And over the past 2 years, Sepp and I have come back to look at a few central themes to his own resilience as a small-scale food producer. In his words, he says, creativity comes out of necessity. We see this with the example of milking once a day and how he came up with this creative solution in the midst of a crisis of a snowstorm, which is linked to how he also faces crisis with not just grit and determination and I'm going to get through this, but actually with liveliness. It's personally what I've seen when he comes most alive is in the face of uncertainty. And I think that's also what we really need in these times of increasing, accelerating change and uncertainty. And I think most farmers do that. quite well. And this example of milking only once a day was because Sepp had maintained the freedom and autonomy over his time and resources. A higher producing cow, he wouldn't have been able to make that change. He wouldn't have been able to have that flexibility. And in the spring when I was there, on the topic of biodiversity subsidies, he got a letter in the mail and he was really angry about it. And I said, why are you so angry? And he said, now, they're giving me 3 options to prove that 7% of my land is biodiverse. And I said, but you do that already. Why are you upset about it? And he said, I'm going to read, we have to leave 9 weeks between mows. If they would give us some flexibility, for example, 8 to 9 weeks, that would really empower farmers to have a bit more of a decision-making power. We don't always want to feel pressurized. Many give up farming for this reason. We farmers have created beautiful landscapes, but now our actions have become so meaningless that we lose our joy. When we feel so patronized, we are made to feel that we farmers have become so stupid that we don't even know how to work with the land anymore. We're the first to realize how the world is changing anyway. If we don't go along with the changes in nature and elsewhere, then we've shot ourselves in the knee, because our livelihoods depend on it. And finally, this idea of what is enough and sufficiency. So milking once a day produces enough milk, and it gives him the flexibility for other on-farm activities. And just looking at this milker, this is me with the hand milker, and this is a conversation we had early on in our collaboration. Sepp said, what are our basic needs as humans? To produce food is a big one. A small part of humanity covers that. And I'm exaggerating now, but everything else contributes to global warming. And I replied that agriculture, industrial agriculture, is a big part of climate change. Sepp says, yes, but we can also give up industrial agriculture, no problem. What? But then the people who are now working in the cities would have to work again with their hands. And I asked him, so how do you come back from that, and what does it mean to work with your hands? For example, you said milking with your hands, but you use this bucket milking machine. Should everyone really milk by hand? Or is a small vacuum milker okay? What about a stand machine or a robot milker? Because, by the way, most of his neighbors have robot milkers in this valley. Exactly, said Sepp. That's the difficult part. Where do we see the boundary? Then I would say this is the absolute highest. It's enough. Simple technique, little expenditure, and a great help. Everything else is luxury. So we have heard from Eduardo the key role that small-scale producers play in producing food, and how disadvantaged and marginalized they often are, and their livelihood and therefore the landscapes they're part of are at great risk. At this point, it feels tempting to scale out and to scale up. Yes, some of these practices, like milking once a day, might be really useful to other farmers too. Imagine gaining those extra hours, enabling them to shift valuable hours to diversify on-farm income. And yes, scaling up to engage with policy is absolutely critical to enable small-scale producers to exist. It's tempting also to impart insights or lessons on creativity, uncertainty, autonomy, and sufficiency, that setting boundaries about what is enough as a quintessential feature to sustainability. But in our work together, Sepp and I challenge what it means to enact, to embody meaningful change within ourselves, with each other, and the world of which we are. Through our research together, I've seen how Sepp creates space to continuously deal with surprise and uncertainty. It's not what he does, but how he does it. It's how he becomes. It's about thinking differently, doing differently, being differently. That opening ourselves up to other beings, humans and non-humans, heightens our feelings, enabling a perception of the world as it truly is, as entangled movement. And we're all capable of this way of being, but it requires openness to the new and a courage to let go. And this is how Sepp farms, and it's how he becomes.
Beautiful.